We shouldn't be teaching everyone about every law of the country that they're going to, but we should be helping facilitate where they look, how they look, the importance of understanding and how they use that information while they're away. So the world of TNL has changed dramatically, and facilitating students to get that information and to be independent in the same way that they would be independent if they were travelling independently, that's what I think we've lost the will to live.
Hi, I'm Dirk Mulder, founder of the Koala News. I'm coming to you from Wonjuk Noongar country in Perth, Western Australia.
And g'day, I'm Rob Malicki. I'm the CEO of the Global Society, coming to you from my holiday today on the wonderful sunny Sunshine Coast. Well, it's a bit rainy today. I'm on Cubby country today. And Dirk might be on holidays, but I must say I've been thinking a lot about work because one of the biggest changes that we could possibly have expected just came out of the blue and smacked us in the side of the head a couple of weeks back. Let's talk about the increase in the visa fee.
Yeah, incredible, isn't it? I mean, we literally had Phil Honeywood in not too long ago, and straight after I think Phil was on, we were into the visa fee. So incredible. Yeah, so look, I mean, the headline, as most people will probably know, because it did happen on the 1st of July, roughly about 10 or so days ago, increased from $710 to $1,600, about 125% hike in a visa fee. Pretty extraordinary. Extraordinary from a few different angles, if I can say that. Firstly, I guess, just covering off the announcement itself, nobody seemed to really see it coming. And from the people that I talked to, there were probably a couple of people that had a phone call on the Sunday night previous to be given a heads up. But I've got to tell you, that Monday morning when the release was uploaded, nobody really saw it coming.
You know what's funny? They should have included student visa fees in the CPI, because government wouldn't have freaking dared to touch visa fees and increase them by 125% if it was included in the cost of inflation or a rise in inflation.
Absolutely. So look, over the last 2 weeks, there's obviously been quite a bit of work done in terms of analysing exactly what the impact will be, if I can put it that way. I think I think what we're fighting with a lot of these government decisions at the moment is they're kind of what seem to be simplistic solutions to obvious problems, if I can say that. And when I say obvious problems, I mean obvious government problems, obviously wanting to reduce demand for incoming international students. But what we've seen over the last couple of weeks is, I guess, on a few different things. So firstly, last Friday, the IAA wrote to Minister Clare and Minister O'Neill seeking for the want of a better word, either a moratorium or a reduction in that visa fee for learning abroad students. And we've got Trevor Goddard on the podcast a little bit later, and I'm sure that we'll dig into it a little bit more. But essentially, $710 to $1,600, it'll act as a massive disincentive for study abroad students or learning abroad students coming into Australia to do that. That'll create a couple of things. So one is, if students drop off, that's a bad thing for Australia. And the reason it's a bad thing for Australia is that most exchange agreements operate on what we term reciprocity. So essentially, as simply as that works, you send us 2 students, we'll send you 2 students back, and we're even. Now, if the numbers coming in are only 1 or none for a number of semesters, that reduces the ability for Australian institutions to be able to send their students out. There's a real negative effect that may occur through that. The other is students that might be coming in, again, if you're coming for 6 months and you're needing to pay $1,600 for a visa, now, as I understand it, there may be an opportunity to access other visas to be able to be here and do shorter term study. So I guess the rationale and what we've been hearing from the government is cleaning up the visa system, adding integrity. This may actually drive behaviour that is counterintuitive to that. So again, what we're seeing is unintended consequences, I think, is the line that are coming from, again, simplistic solutions to simplistic government problems. We see that beyond just learning abroad as well. So I know that, for instance, in the English space, if you're coming for a 5-week English program or a 10-week English program, and you're now having to pay $1,600 for a visa for that, what's going to be the disincentive to actually enrolling in that? And maybe the government says, bang on, that's what we're trying to do. But it does seem to disproportionately affect the international student market, rather than just looking at what most people would assume is a 3-year bachelor or 4-year bachelor student or a 2-year master's student, where that visa cost can be spread out over a longer period of time.
Yeah, and as you've pointed out, both on this podcast and in the Koala, at the moment with visa processing being, feels like a lucky tip, if you're going to get your visa or not. Even if you're in one of the Category 1, institutions, even if you're going to a Category 1 institution under the Simplified Student Visa Framework, the SSVF, the certainty for people to basically gamble $1,600 not knowing whether or not their visa is going to be approved is kind of just getting beyond the realms of what's fair for starters.
Yeah.
But what people are going to be prepared to do. That's just reality.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we looked at with Study Move consultants, so Kerry Ramirez and the team there, we actually worked through some modelling, and the modelling would suggest, so if you think about, the income to government from lodgements, and again, the point that you make is really important. How elastic is our sector based on a visa fee? And I think we're going to find that out fairly shortly. So as the visa fee rises, elasticity would say that purchases drop off. What we've seen, I guess, over through this process and through the modelling is that we would require a 55% reduction in lodgements for the government to acquire the same amount of money as it did prior to the announcement, if that makes sense. So certainly the government's wanting to take the heat or take the demand out of it. If visa lodgements drop 30%, the government's going to be making more money. If they drop 40%, they're still going to be making more money than what they would in the government coffers. The break-even point that we found was a 55% reduction. If visa lodgements drop off more than 55%, the government's actually going to be in a worse position than what it is now in terms of income for the visas. Now, remember that this increase in the visa fee is meant to offset other programs in the government and that are being implemented through the Accord process. So it's really, really important to understand the link between this and what the behaviour of lodgements and what students may do offshore will determine how successful other programs might be across the government.
What's interesting, though, is that what you're talking about there is simply a reduction, is the government coffers. Are the government coffers going to be lower or impacted by that? But of course, if we have 30% less students in the country, the $48 billion impact for the country is impacted. So
yeah, absolutely.
Government might be line ball on their accounts, but the nation as a whole. And once again, I hate to oversimplify and just say that this is just a number, but sometimes you feel governments will only pay attention to the economics of this. But let's say it's a 20% decline, 30% decline, pick your number. Then shave that off a $48 billion industry, and you're not just affecting institutions or government coffers. You're affecting mum and dad businesses down the street, serving coffees, and fill in the blank. Like, it's literally Australia-wide that we're going to be seeing the pinch from this. It's just
for sure.
Short-sighted, Dirk. Why do we?
Absolutely. Oh, no, it's incredible. So one of the things a company called Voyage did was actually, they're a student-facing organisation. They actually did a bit of research into the sentiment that students feel, and a number of these are offshore as well. So what we're seeing is 49.8% anger, 28.1% sadness, and 15.8% in disgust. So obviously Australia now having by far the highest student visa fee globally by daylight between Australia and the next one. This is the feeling that's coming back from students. And some of the, I guess, the more qualitative data that's coming back is that students are now asking themselves the question, are they cash cows? Are they actually the cash cows? Because it just seems a bit ridiculous.
You know what? I'll be fascinated to talk to Trevor Goddard, our guest, a little bit later on the episode, because Trevor is such a great long-term thinker, and I'm really looking forward to him unpacking some of those unexpected consequences because, governments just, I think, are really bad at doing that generally. But we're lucky to have a guest on that's a very good thinker, so looking forward to hearing from Trevor a little bit later in the episode. And of course, this is already flowing through. Of course, the announcement about the visa cost has just landed, but visas being granted are already down.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, I mean, we've spoken about this on many podcasts before, but probably since, middle of December when the ministerial direction was handed down, we saw a significant tail off in visas being granted. Again, the team at Study Move, headed by Kerry Ramirez, did a little bit of a look into this. So, look, the headlines really, roughly around 160,000 fewer student visas compared to the same period last year, or down 44%. So it's a significant number. The most significant changes have been in student visas granted for VET. So VET's down 73% and ELICOS is down 52%. So when you think about ELICOS being, for the want of a better word, the canary in the coal mine, we've heard that, but also a pathway provider into other sectors, we're going to see that personified over time. That snowball's going to grow and that negativity. One of the interesting tidbits that came out of Kerry's work was across all sectors, students from India, Nepal, Colombia and the Philippines have at least a decrease of 60% in student visas granted compared to the same period last year. And why is that important? It's important because all these countries are in our top 10 source countries for Australia. And so when we think about that, countries in our top 10 decreasing by more than 60%, significant. Rob, significant.
It's like shooting yourself in the foot. Yeah, one of the comments that when the visa fee was released, I think one of the press releases, there was a comment from one of the ministers saying we're fixing a broken system. And as you and I have discussed on this podcast, we sort of broke it down and went, okay, so you're looking at a kind of shonky provider percentage of a couple of percent. Let's be generous and say that it's a 5% shonky provider ratio. But it's like chopping off the limb in order to stem the gangrene in one finger.
I was thinking about this analogy exactly. Before it probably, if it was a car, before it had a flat tire, now it's up on blocks and it's missing its wheels.
Yeah, right. Oh my goodness gracious. In fact, for listeners, I've actually reached out to Minister Jason Clare. I've invited him to come on the podcast because I get a lot of feedback from people who are listening, saying, okay, it's great hearing you guys break down the news and we've got a lot of stats and figures, but wouldn't it be great to hear from the minister who's responsible for some of these enormous decisions? So Jason Clare's team, if you're listening to this, we would love to have you on the podcast. Happy to give you questions in advance, but we'd love to hear exactly some of the rationale for some of these decisions. Let's move on, Dirk. Let's move to happier places. AIEC, the program is now out, the Australian International Education Conference. That's always a fun time of year seeing what's made the list.
Absolutely it is. I had a bit of a look over it and, mate, there's a session in there that really stood out to me. I'm actually really looking forward to it. Sally Gattenby, who was on the podcast a little while ago and is obviously one of the organisers or a key person involved in the organisation of AIEC, she's running a session with Andrew Tees and it's called Barbecue Conversations. And I really like the sound of that. And I think we spoke with Sally offline about this exact topic. International education, often outside of the sector, people just don't know about it. And this session's focused on getting people to know about international education. What are the lines you can tell somebody over a barbecue? You stand around the barbecue having a glass of wine or a beer, and somebody says to you, what do you do? And you say, oh, I'm in international education. Oh, is that like exchange? This is the session to go to start picking up some of those key points on how to talk to people outside of the sector socially about what we do. And I think it's so important, Rob. I really do.
Yeah, love it. And we will have someone from IDP on in a couple of weeks' time on the next news episode to dive into detail on the full program. I'm really looking forward to it. I must admit, I only had time to sort of have a glance through some of the things that are on there, but I'm just so excited come October. It's going to be a great conference. And full disclosure, the Global Horizons is the official podcast of the AIEC conference, and you will find me and Dirk, I hope you too, on the exhibition floor, podcasting live. So definitely will be there on the floor. Moving along though, there's been an important appointment by Austrade, a new head of international education. Who's that?
It is, drumroll, Elodie Journet. So Elodie has come in. She's now the Assistant General Manager of Education and Skills, I believe is the full title, which includes heading up international education promotion. So look, mate, I guess, let's look back. Melissa Banks obviously was in that role some time ago. Helen Kronberger has done a fantastic job in holding the fort until Elodie's appointment. But mate, I've got to tell you, I'm not sure I'd want to be in her shoes at the moment. I mean, could you imagine having the responsibility of promoting this sector while, other parts of the government are pulling the handbrake? Mate, she's got a tough job, that's for sure.
I guess, just sort of having looked through her profile on LinkedIn, I don't know Elodie personally, but deep experience inside Austrade and working inside government. So that all sort of points to the skill set that's needed to make those sort of incremental changes and to shift policy, set good policy. So it'll be very interesting to see, as you say, like, wow, that's a heck of a job to be picking up. And best of luck to Elodie. We're looking forward to working with her and the team going forward. And finally, mate, there was a very catchy headline in the Koala this week. This has been one of your best, I must admit. And if you'll humour me, can I do this?
Yes, of course.
Thunderbirds are go. I've been waiting all week to do that. Thunderbirds are go. What are we talking about?
Every time I see kind of like a launch announcement or something like that, I think of that line, and it takes me back to, when I was 10 years old, watching the TV before mum and dad were going to take me to my little soccer game or whatever, and sitting there watching the Thunderbirds, and they'd always count down and say that exact line. So I love throwing it in where I can, and I think it's really, really good. So yeah, look, mate, Thunderbirds a go, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Deakin commences classes in India this week, and I think it's such a fantastic thing that an Australian university is the first university to open its doors in India, not just announcing, not just building, not just opening the doors, but now they're actually teaching. So 40 students in their first cohort across 2 programs. That's a Master of Cybersecurity Professional and a Master of Business Analytics. So best of luck to Deakin, best of luck to obviously the first cohort, and certainly the Koala is sitting back watching from afar and hoping it all goes really, really well.
You got to give them credit because they have really hustled to get that live, haven't they? Because it feels like
they sure have.
It feels like less than 12 months. Must only be 9 months since the announcement by India opening up the doors to allow foreign providers to be onshore delivering their programs. Deakin, of course, first in the door, and Wollongong as well, shortly thereafter. So to actually get programs up and running inside 12 months is a heck of an achievement. And of course, John Maloney is DVC International over there, so I'm sure had a hand in that.
PVC? Yeah.
PVC, and a very, very strong team at Deakin. So well done to everybody over there.
Deakin's had a massive presence in South Asia, based out of Delhi for a long time. So they're probably one of the few universities that could have pulled it off. So they've done really, really well. And again, congratulations to them.
You can't afford to miss the Australian International Education Conference, happening from the 22nd to the 25th of October at the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre. AIEC's the place to meet over 1,600 international education delegates from Australia and overseas. Build your own learning schedule, gain insights from sector experts, new research findings, and spark ideas at lively discussion sessions. Plus, there's plenty of networking opportunities, from the expo hall to brain dates and social events. Make sure you're at AIEC 2024 in Melbourne. Learn more at aiec.idp.com.
Right, Dirk, should we bring in our guests?
Absolutely, Rob. We should. Trevor Goddard, welcome to the Global Horizons Koala News podcast. Mate, it's a pleasure to have you on board.
Rob, Dirk, thank you. Delighted to be here. Looking forward to having a chat.
Absolutely. Mate, before we start, mate, you've had quite an illustrious career in international education. Can you just give us a bit of a background in terms of, I guess, how you started off in international education, how you got to kind of where you are today?
Yeah, okay. Probably a good starting point is to admit that I didn't come through the traditional study abroad, exchange, traditional education experience myself. My international experience came from some more sport-related things as I was pushing my way through uni. So I'll speak to those just briefly. Out of school, I got a cadetship for some work with what was then Ernst & Winnie, now Ernst & Young, as an auditor. So my life could have been completely different. The beauty of that was that it allowed me to study for 6 months and then go and work for 6 months. And that meant that after 2 years, I sidled up to the partner and had a chat and say, look, loving working for you, loving the place, but this is not where I see myself going. Shook hands, parted ways. He was probably one of my first mentors without me realising what he was doing. And I'd always had a strong inkling for the health sciences and had spoken to friends about occupational therapy and made a very quick and easy jump the next year into occupational therapy. If I sort of push that forward, one of the opportunities I had through studying occupational therapy was to hang out with some groups and associations that supported people with disabilities, and very quickly was able to combine my love of sport with this new career trajectory I was taking, and found myself doing some guide running with a couple of local people, which was an interesting experience. So I had, by that stage, stopped running professionally, I'll say, in inverted commas myself, and found this other avenue to keep running at a fairly high level. A story that sits within that I still am slightly embarrassed about, even until today, is that one of the guys that I ran with for a long time, you'll appreciate this coming from Perth, the old logs in the park with the two verticals and the horizontal across. I ran a guy straight into one of those at 6 o'clock in the evening. I didn't see it. So he went over, I went over, and the shins were sore for a very, very long time. One of the first lessons in, having to take responsibility for someone else and with someone else, and, we went down in a screaming heap. But I got up literally and figuratively and went on from there. And that was the start of something really big for me personally. And that was that I got selected in the Australian team to go to the Barcelona and Atlanta Paralympic Games. So that was my international experience. I went from World Championships in Holland in 1990, ran in Barcelona, ran in Atlanta in front of 90,000 people. And so, with Paris coming up now, that's my go-to TV every 4 years, watching the Paralympics, with a great deal of pride looking back on how I was involved very early on in some of the development around the way that visually impaired athletes ran. So if anyone's watching Paris, the T11 category for totally blind runners, that's where I was, and it's a great thing to look at and support. And the men and women that run those races are elite athletes and should be celebrated in that way. That was really aligned with occupational therapy, and that was where my career was going. And what started to happen was that every time I was overseas, I saw other ways of learning and taking something from that experience myself. Even if I just go back to Barcelona and the Paralympics, I remember sitting in the meal hall with 6,000 athletes, and I'm sitting at a table where there's someone using a knife and fork with their toes. There's someone who's being meal assisted with a care staff member. There's me sitting with my colleague who was visually impaired. There's people having a peg feed in a tube. And it was one of those moments that it sort of makes you realise that I was the other in that circumstance, for want of putting it a different way. And that really, to me, sparked my curiosity. And I think I'd always been a curious person. I get that from my mum, just always asking a question. And whether it's asking it verbally, it can be asking it visually as well. I just love looking at things and trying to understand how it works and why it's different. And that's where my love of all things international came from, was realising that things weren't better or worse, things were just different. And so the more you tried to understand how they got to that point, the better off you then understood yourself as well. And that was a really important part of understanding my own learning style. As I said earlier, that was really my international experience through my university experience. That was the equivalent of a study abroad or exchange experience. Along with that, having done occupational therapy and traveling overseas and then coming back, I ended up, ironically, coincidentally, back at the School of Occupational Therapy. During that process, I had the opportunity to put together with a colleague of mine, Nigel Gribble at Curtin, who's a fantastic therapist. We had the opportunity to co-design what was called Go Global at that point. And that stemmed out of an experience that I had working up in China. I was very fortunate to get a World Health Organization consultancy position, working with an organization in Shanghai that was delivering therapy services to children with cerebral palsy. It was one of the first private organisations in Shanghai to do that. In working with the director over a period of time, we sort of, as we got to know each other, worked out that, I was taking this wonderful body of knowledge away myself and learning a lot. And I wanted to find a way of bringing that back into one of the better experiences. And the way to do that seemed to be to take those people away, to take the students up. So after, I guess, a year and a half of talking through what that might look like, and this is, to put a timestamp on it, this is going back to 2001, 2002. So a lot of barriers at that point around curriculum, accreditation, students going overseas to China. I ended up taking a group of 7 the first year. And by the time I finished up with that program, when I moved over to Melbourne in 2010, that program was taking about 130 or 140 each year, and had also spread into India, Ukraine, and South Africa. And just a quick story, because this is really important about where my switch over into international ed really came from. about 4 years into that program, we wanted to do something for the centre. Curtin, as the university, wanted to do something to acknowledge all the time and energy that they'd given us. We spoke to the director about, what would that look like? If we want to recognise you in some way, we want to do it in a way that's useful for you as well. And she said, well, look, it's really difficult for us to get any airplay, press, media coverage in Shanghai. And so many people don't know that we exist. They can't find us. And so what we ended up doing was making a presentation of a plaque that was signed by the Vice-Chancellor, Dean of Health Sciences. And we were very fortunate at the time, a fabulous Australian diplomat, Sam Jerovich at the time, who was the Consul General in Shanghai, came and presented it on behalf of the university. So part of my role was organising that. Consequently, Airplay CCTV 9 in China, which at that point, main English language speaking channel, not suggesting we got this coverage, but that has reached out to the 800, 900 million people in China, so it would have got a fair few people watching. That was the opening for her, and we still speak about that today as being a small yet significant part of launching what she was doing in China, and that came through us giving that publicity or enabling that publicity to happen through her connection with Curtin. And, when I keep looking back on that opportunity for Sam to come and do that, the willingness of our Vice-Chancellor to put his name on that was me sort of going, hey, I really like this idea of it not just being about the delivery of the service, but it's bringing in all these other representatives, both from industry and government, to actually stimulate the learning experience. And even for the students that got to go on that trip where we made that presentation, that became the talking point. And I think that really helped me realise that there was more to the study abroad experience than just the initial reason or the classroom learning experience. It was what was happening outside where you could really add value to what you were doing.
Well, one of the things that I always find amazing is the backstory on how people get into international education. What I kind of find is that nobody really sets their career goals to say, I want to be a manager of learning abroad, or I want to be a director international in a university. People just tend to end up there. So hearing these backstories, I think is fascinating. And Trevor, what an experience. The Paralympic Games into, occupational therapy and then launching a program which is so successful. And from memory, working at Curtin myself, it's still going. So, kudos to you, mate. Kudos to you.
Thank you. But also to the colleagues that remained and kept going and have built that. I think the thing I'm most proud of that I don't take any credit for, but I love watching, is that, and Rob, you'll appreciate this, that program is now getting NCP mobility funding. We'll come to NCP a bit later on, but, what a lovely full circle to be involved in generating and setting something up that's had so many iterations and so many wonderful people going through. And look, each of those countries that I spoke to, we had a fabulous coordinator into South Africa, Zona Renz, Kiralee Manning into Ukraine, Nigel Gribble into India. Those staff members did an amazing job in setting up and mirroring those programs. And so the fact that they're now getting NCP funding all this 20-odd years later is testament to the work that they've done in perpetuating the learning experience.
Absolutely. Wonderful acknowledgement.
Trevor, one of the things I've always enjoyed in our conversations is the fact you're such a great long-term thinker. I remember, and I'm going to segue us into some of the current news here, but I remember this story from when you were running the Go Global program and some students came to you and said, we'd like to raise some money to, I can't remember exactly what it was. I think it might have been Vietnam, raise some money to build a school or to build something or, make some sort of contribution to the community. And you kind of said to them, yes, but what I want to see is your 10-year plan for continuing to fund this to make sure that it doesn't fall over. So, of course, you can build a school somewhere, but then the community has all of the running costs that come along with that. And I remember just being blown away. I think I must have been in my 20s at the time, just being like, that is such a great way to look at something. It's like, you might want to do good, but in fact, in trying to do good, you can actually create a whole set of problems that come along with that. And here comes a segue. Sorry, I just froze there for a second. Australian government, Dirk and I have just talked about this at length. Australian government has just more than doubled the visa fee for international students coming to Australia. As a very good long-term thinker, what's your perspective on what this does to international education for Australia?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. And very, very clever segue. The notion of the longer-term thinking is so important for learning abroad. My gut says to me that this is a point in time where we need to recognise that international education is a suite of offerings that all sit together. They don't stand in isolation. So we can talk about the 10, 12,000 students that come in on non-award and talk about the direct financial cost. Incredibly important. I think where the longer term risk here is we go back to 2019 and the 58, 60,000 students that are going outbound into the countries where these students are coming from, the reputational risk cannot be measured. And that's where the problem is going to strike us. Now, if I try and pull out two concrete examples, our two major source countries are also two of our countries for outbound, or two of our largest countries for the outbound market as well. To me, it would not come as a surprise if there's a lessening of the collegiality that comes from some institutions, some people, some organisations, because the way that they see Australia viewing their students and development of their higher education sector has been hit. And I think that's where we need to be incredibly careful that it's not just an upfront cost in the short term and a direct enrolment. It's also about how our partners perceive and view the way that we treat their national citizens as well.
I love that take on things, Trevor. I really feel that the overlooked part of this, obviously there's the financial implications of it, but the impact in terms of our relationships, the perception of Australia as a warm, friendly, welcoming destination for people of all backgrounds is really under threat here. And that sort of stigmatized, what do you call it, perception that international students are only cash cows. I mean, what a fantastic way for the government just to rubber stamp that and be like, yep, that's actually how we see it.
Absolutely. The irony in this scenario is that the solution is actually present within the problem from my perspective. At the risk of keeping on going back to the 2019 data set, which is the last big set pre-COVID, I'm just going to give you, if you give me a little bit of poetic license here, I'm going to give you some figures to show why I think it's such an important group of people. If you take 58,000 just across the universities alone, the average time spent overseas by each of those students is around 5 to 6 weeks coming out of the data set. This is where it gets mind-blowing. That's 5,700 years of time. That's the equivalent of 73 average lifespans. So if I said to you, you can take 73 people and take them away permanently and they become your representatives overseas. I'm just using that as an example to say there's the small A ambassadors, or the power of the soft diplomacy and the relationships. And that happens year after year after year after year. So I think in managing the perception and changing the perception, there's just such a wonderful opportunity to reinvigorate this part of the sector and use these young people, use in a nice way, as Australian representatives overseas to influence and change that perception. I think it's a missed opportunity, and one that us as a sector need to step up and take lead on. If you allow me just to push that point one more, data underpins that. You've got to have data to consolidate your messaging. And I think historically, the learning abroad sector, incredibly passionate about the individual. If I'm be honest, I think we've struggled to advocate from a sectoral point of view. If I go back to 2017, 2018, we would have had 34, 35 of the 39 universities all submitting their learning abroad data. That's now down to about 23 universities. So 58, 59% of universities submitting their data. It's tough. It's time consuming. It's hard to track. It's not the high profile part of the job, but without that data, the national picture doesn't get painted. And unless you paint that national picture, then you don't get a seat at the table. You don't support your messaging. You don't record your history, and you can't define your value. So I think as a group, the learning abroad sector needs to support each other in bringing that data set together to make sure that they give government something that they can hang their hat on as well.
As you were talking, Trevor, what I was thinking about was just the recovery of learning abroad. And of course, for those who aren't really familiar with it, learning abroad is students from Australian institutions taking an experience and going somewhere else in the world. So it's the outbound side of international education. And of course, having been in international ed for 20 years and spent a lot of time in learning abroad, to me it seemed like every time institutions are really hit hard with their budgets, with crises and things like that, what ends up happening is learning abroad is one of those areas which gets deprioritised. And it ends up taking a long time to recover. Firstly, I mean, do you share that view, Trevor? And if you do, what do you think these kind of current changes mean for the recovery of learning abroad post-pandemic?
I do share the view, but I'll come at it through a different lens, Rob. I think the opportunity...
Just pause there. You need. Don't lose your thought, but I just want to point out to listeners what you just did there, because this is one of your superpowers. You and Kent Anderson are the two people that do it, and I absolutely love it. It's like you get asked a question and you pause and you reflect and you say, good question, but I think there's a better way to frame it. And then on you go. I'm just pointing that out to listeners. That was a masterstroke, what you just did.
We'll take compliment, but also the opportunity to explain. That comes from watching a number of colleagues and learning, and it's part of that reflective practice that I think sometimes I'm always conscious of what's the principle behind the question and what do you want to hear from that question. So I'll even stop sometimes and ask, why are you asking me that question? Is there somewhere where you want this to go? Where's this going to land? And that's an important part of the dialogue. Not surprisingly, my approach to learning abroad takes that into consideration. I'm very keen to understand what the students want to learn and what their expectation is. But something, I'll just drop this in, Rob, and we might come back to it. Something I'm interested in at the moment is that I feel we may have gone, controversially, we may have gone a little bit too far towards the student experience dominating the conversation and forgetting that within the experience there is an institutional experience and a national experience as well. And they're really, really important. And I think that comes back to your initial question around visa and costing. But back to your question around what this actually means in the recovery. I think the opportunity or where you might be going is that the opportunity is there for learning abroad to redefine the value that it brings to the sector. And that requires some uncovering of a more data-led set of responses. We've spent a lot of time talking about learning abroad being a precursor to good career outcomes, good graduate outcomes. They're still very individually focused, and I think they're incredibly strong and powerful value propositions. What I'd like to see more is of how the institution links a learning abroad program up into a research partnership it has with that institution overseas, or getting aligned with your industry collaborators and putting people through internships within the organisations that your institution already partners with. They seem to me to be commonsensical ways of actually leveraging the whole ecosystem, because that's what universities are. My fear around this going too far down the student experience road is that students, of course, are front and centre of what universities do, but look at the other wealth of activity that goes on in and around and the way they make contribution to community and nation.
Yeah, it's almost the sum of the parts, right?
Rob and Dirk, so at the moment, some of the organisations I'm working with don't sit in the traditional learning abroad space, but it still has that notion of learning from the overseas experience. So I've moved a little horizontally as well and working with scholarship organisations, fellowships, foundations, as well as universities, schools, associations, and increasingly corporations that are putting their staff through, or executive staff through, PD programs overseas as well. And the similarities are there. The international experience, i.e. learning abroad, is only one element. What I'm really asking them to focus on, and this is a growth spot for the universities, is the pre-departure phase and the post phase as well, which is incredibly important. How are you setting yourself up to learn? And then how are you applying that learning when you come back? And I think the analogy there in the university space would be how to increase that engagement with the academic programs as well. We have wonderful one-off examples about students writing assignments on something that they saw. I guess I'm interested in a deeper exploration of that as to how you allow a student to continue that learning abroad experience right through the rest of their degree.
It's funny you say that, Trevor. When I was at Murdoch, I worked with Jan Gothard, who was part of an ALTC grant program that was bringing the learning home. And it was exactly based on what you're talking about. How do you continue? How do you embed? How do you ensure that students, when they return home, can reflect and actually understand conceptually the skills that they've learnt through their experience? How do they then apply them, as you say, into looking for a job? How do you explain your abroad experience to a potential employer? And how does that then go? And that then developed into a minor in global engagement, which was run across the institution. So I think you're absolutely right. It's more than just the experience. It's about being able to reflect on that experience, being able to see it multidimensionally, if I can put it that way, from a distance almost, and being able to say, well, that's how I learnt, that's what I went through, and this is how it now pertains and the skills that I learnt from that into the future, not just into potentially future study, but beyond that, into my life, into my career, into employment, into relationships, et cetera, et cetera. I couldn't agree with you more on that point.
The difficult part of that, Dirk, is that there's a time element to that as well. And I think we've become a little bit too, dare I say, obsessed with the immediacy of evaluation. I used to call it the chucking a microphone in the face as they hopped off the plane. And of course, they've all had a great time. They've all eaten some awesome food, met some wonderful people, and they're on cloud nine, as anyone would be. What I think I'm more interested in and would like to help organisations track is what's the impact in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, and 20 years' time, and then to be able to retrofit that back into programs. Because all of a sudden, the value proposition for a vice-chancellor, if you're pitching for $2 million in new scholarship money, the value proposition of students that can clearly articulate their career change, I'm an example of that have come back into postgrad study, that have gone out to work and brought their industry contacts back into the organisation, that have volunteered back as an alum into an internship program. There's value in that to the university. Now, that's also far more measurable, long-term and embedded in the institution, and that has a much higher value proposition. So I think part of the difficulty is evaluating things, what I would call at the right time. Finding the time to ask the right question is an important part of getting the information. And, coming back to that data set conversation, right question at the right time.
Trying to convince a vice-chancellor, but maybe also trying to convince a foreign minister. Maybe it's a good moment to take a left turn into the new Colombo plan, the NCP. And of course, Trevor, you and I were involved in the NCP from well before it was the NCP, before it had a name, before it had anything. You and I were involved in conversations with Julie Bishop and others, Don Markwell, to actually help design the program. It's, of course, celebrating its 10 years this year. What do you see as some of the best achievements of the programs? And maybe if I can ask you to be controversial, because I know you love a bit of controversy, what would you like to see the program doing over the next 10 years? So I've just committed the ultimate interviewing crime, which is asking the double barrel question. Let's start with the first 10 years, some reflections on the first 10 years.
I had locked both of them away, ready to come back to the second one. In terms of the first 10 years, I'm going to answer the first question conservatively and the second question aggressively. And I'll explain how I think the two come together in a moment. The conservative one is, I think it's done a very good job of bedding itself down. Governments come and go, departments come and go, flavours come and go, names come and go. So to essentially look the same as you did when you started, in some senses, while conservative, can have the effect of building and digging down, investing in longevity. And I think that could be a very useful thing. And so I'm going to back it in. That's going to be around for a while in its current format. I called it the bells and whistles model, the DFAT overlay, a sense of what everyone in the nation would have known as learning abroad, continuing business as usual, but with this lovely DFAT connectivity, giving it a presence in the region and a champion in the region in Julie Bishop. And that to me was its strength. And I think it's held on to that. We can all in the sector who have been around for 30 years name 3, 4, 7 programs that have come and then gone as quickly as they arose. So I think to still be essentially in the same format after 10 years is something to be proud of. So there's the conservative part of the element, because sometimes there's a lot of rowing behind the scenes to keep that going, as per normal. What would I like to see it do?
Aggressive, Trevor.
Yeah, alumni. What's happened to the global alumni strategy? What has happened to alumni beyond drinks and nibbles?
What was the global alumni strategy? Because I agree, this kind of was something for a while and just seems to have disappeared.
Yeah. So if it's having another gestation, then I'd love for that to be a little more in the public domain, because I think the NCP, as the largest of the outbound mechanics that fits into that, again, has a very unique offering to make. Wonderful strategy around our international student population, our Australia Awards recipients, etc. The NCP really holds itself front and centre as being the counterpoint or the balance to that. And the opportunity to have them as the outbound contributing is another place where the value of that program can land. So I'd love to see some more aggressive movement in that domain.
Really interesting point. I was fortunate to be an assessor for the NCP last year. One of the key weighted areas was around how to bring that experience back. So I kind of feel like it's somewhat disappointing that that's not being taken advantage of. It's certainly in terms of the entry, it has a high prominence in terms of the application process, of having students who are going into the NCP program being aware that there is an obligation at the end of it to bring that learning, to talk about it, to promote the program, and to work with fellow alumni. So I feel like I said, it's somewhat disappointing that that's not actually occurring.
Really simple solution, Dirk, and very easy for me to say from the comfort of a podcast. And that is, you have to teach people how to do that. I'll give two very quick, hopefully, anecdotes that demonstrate that point. Many moons ago, back in my Curtin days, when I was a senior lecturer delivering community health and development courses, I went to a teaching and learning seminar around giving feedback. And my big takeaway, and I repeat this story ad nauseum, and many people listening now will have probably heard me speak it at some point. The facilitator running the course said, the only way to give good feedback is to actually tell people that you're giving them the feedback. Otherwise, they don't realise it's feedback. The analogy being, the reason people don't know what to do when they come back is because we haven't taught them what they could do or how to do it. So it's very, very simple. Very, very simple. And the second part is a slightly tongue-in-cheek at our ex-Greens leader, Adam Bant, and his little press club, go Google it comment that I was desperate to find a way of bringing this in, because I think he stole that from me. Tongue firmly planted in cheek. I think I was at a pre-departure session 10, 12 years ago, and there was a question from the audience around the weather related to the place that this person was going. And I stood at the lectern, and as Rob would say, did my inevitable 5-second pause. And I did stop and looked him in the eye and just said, Google it, mate. Because I think what we've lost the methodology in doing is that we're teaching people the actual fact rather than teaching them how to get to the fact. We shouldn't be teaching everyone about every law of the country that they're going to, but we should be helping facilitate where they look, how they look, the importance of understanding and how they use that information while they're away. So the world of TNL has changed dramatically, and facilitating students to get that information and to be independent in the same way that they would be independent if they were traveling independently. That's what I think we've lost the will to live.
That's the grab at the beginning of the program. We've lost the will to live.
Just very conscious of the time. There was a couple of things I wanted to try and slip in, which was around, the FTAs and ASEAN region, Southeast Asia economic strategy, and how we don't, learning abroad, we don't really sort of talk about that. It's just sort of there. I wanted to try and just make a comment about how we need to speak more into that space. Yeah.
Obviously, by this point, Trevor, we're 10 years in. We've spent as a country probably close to $500 million on the NCP program. And obviously it's still funded into the forward estimate, so the government's committed to continuing to run the program. What other sorts of things do you think, we as a nation should expect from that investment, other than student experiences and soft diplomacy?
Let me start with the student experience, because again, that's front and centre. And I certainly don't want to give the implication that I'm implying it's not important. It's a spectrum. It's not polarised. It's not that we talk about student experience and then stop, and then we talk about industry and we stop and we talk about government. They all sit together. So where I think there's huge potential for uplift, upside, capability building, is to make sure that whatever we design around the student experience that links into industry absolutely dovetails beautifully into government agenda as well. You know, we're off the back of the 50th anniversary of the Australian partnership into the ASEAN dialogue and the conferences in Melbourne in March this year. We've just had, in November last year, we've had the Southeast Asia Economic Strategy 2040. Preceding that, leading up to that, we had the Vietnam Enhanced Economic Engagement Strategy. We've had the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Now these, sometimes they sound like documents that float above the surface somewhere. But I think learning abroad can engage themselves politically, small p politics, in those conversations. So tying programs into an agenda item. Within each of those three documents I mentioned, they absolutely front and centre have people-to-people exchange sitting within them as an explicit agenda item. We should be dovetailing sweetly into that, as many of the universities do within their industry engagement and partnerships. And a quick shout out, when I say just, about a year ago, finished up a block of work with AsiaLink. And I look at the work that Martine Letts, Lee Howard and Rob Law are doing out there. And that gave me a really interesting insight, again, through a different lens of how industry works within those documents. And there's a lot that the universities could learn, and learning abroad, in how to engage with those documents and those agendas to increase the level of activity they get in those countries. And the ASEAN region is ripe for that. So essentially, to sum all that up, there's a wonderful opportunity to be more politically engaged as a learning abroad community.
I'm getting absolutely devoured up here on the Sunshine Coast. What's going on the Sunshine Coast? That's my question to you.
Be careful of that Ross River.
Hey, Rob and Dirk, just reflecting on other international ed experiences. Obviously, we all spend a lot of time on the road and travelling. And I just wanted to shout out to a really fine colleague and an excellent human that you've already interviewed, and that's Tracy Harris. And she made a comment on one of your earlier podcasts just around the very unglamorous. And I was reflecting on that for quite a while as to what my approach to travel had been. And I thought it was worth just sharing that, as well as the student experience, the other element that was always important to me was to try and travel like a student. Now, I know that sounds slightly corny, but just as an example, at the EAIEs and the NAFSAs of the world, I would always stay in a hotel that was 10, 15 kilometres away. I wouldn't stay in the major chains. And it just meant that you met different people, had different experiences, had a slightly different experience of the city. Just one very quick example of where that happened. In Vancouver, I stayed at a very, very small B&B on the outskirts, and so had about a 45-minute run into the city, but ended up meeting a guy at breakfast one morning who was there on a Churchill Fellowship looking at forestry management in British Columbia to come back and bring that knowledge back to New South Wales and Victoria. So it was just fascinating that there we were, international education, Churchill Fellowship, both learning and looking at ways of sharing that knowledge. So it was just a shout out to Tracy for acknowledging that while it's unglamorous, often by putting yourself out into those positions, you get to meet some awesome people and have very different experiences that sit outside the conference circuit.
As we like to say, it's all about the stories. Awesome having you on the Global Horizons podcast, Trevor. Thanks heaps for joining us, and look forward to catching you a little bit later in the year, hopefully at one of the NCP 10-year anniversary events. And for everybody listening along, of course, all the news, the Koala News is your place to grab up-to-date information, what's going on in Australian international education. If you're not subscribed by now, you are absolutely missing out, so don't hesitate, thekoalanews.com. Dirk, always a pleasure to chat, mate. Thank you for keeping us up to date.
Ditto, Rob.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate the time to talk.
Thank you, Trevor.
The Global Horizons podcast is brought to you by the Global Society, Australia's learning abroad support company. For about 10 years, the Global Society has been supporting Australian learning abroad teams with technology, training, consulting, strategy, marketing, you name it. We all know that learning abroad is time-consuming and complex, so if your team could use a little bit of extra support, reach out to the Global Society, globalsociety.com.au.
Today's episode was recorded on Garigal land in Sydney, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thank you. See you next time.